basically games for neurodivergent populations. I think this can really be a conversation, right? So if you have questions at any point, just ask them, interrupt us. We'll do our best to keep an eye on things, basically. Because I think a lot of this is still very much, a work in progress, pieces for reflection. So we're just interested in also hearing from you. So Maria has already given a very nice introduction of us. Katta, if you'd just quickly like to say something about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, as Maria already said, I research marginalized perspectives in interaction design. I do so largely with a focus on disabilities and also gender to some degree. But I'm focusing more and more on disabilities. I do not call myself an accessibility researcher. For anything, I call myself an access researcher. And maybe we can discuss the distinction later. But like my goal is kind of oriented more on disability justice and these kind of frameworks and self-determination, as we will talk more explicitly about very, very soon.
Yes. Okay. Right, and I'm Kathrin. I'm awkwardly between jobs. Maria said I'm still at KU Leuven, that's true, but from this December, I'll actually be moving back to my home country in Germany to work at KIT, which is a big technical university there. But Katta and I both worked at KU Leuven, and that's where, a lot of this work actually was done and was thought of. So I think where we meet in our work is that we're both interested in technology and marginalization, and that actually also includes the interplay that you see between disability and games. And then we've had some meta-level thoughts basically on how disability is viewed by games research. And that also leads over to the question of, what experiences do we actually provide for disabled players, particularly from the perspective of researchers? And I mean, some of you may be working on serious games, some of you may be interested in games for health, for example. And I think what we'll hopefully be able to communicate in our talk is that there are certain constraints that come with specific perspectives that prevail in our research communities without taking away too much of what's going to come. But obviously, that wider topic area also includes looking at games for neurodivergent people. Just so that we're on the same page, and picture credit is allocated below. What we understand as neurodivergent, it includes different groups of people. So, for example, when we talk about neurodivergence, we think about autism, but we also think about people who have ADHD, for example. It could also be anxiety that somebody experiences, or things like dyslexia, for example. So it's a really wide range of people who are basically kind of seen under that umbrella and within that group. And so you also have to look at our work from that wider angle, although you'll see that actually in games research for neurodivergent players, there's a lot of focus on autism and on ADHD. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. So the foundation, what our talk is rooted in today is basically an examination of what human-computer interaction games research has concerned itself with in terms of play for neurodivergent populations. HCI is an interdisciplinary field. It's still seen as somehow a subset of computer science, so we're kind of coming with a technical background, but also from the perspective of media studies, for example. So it's become this big melting pot, and maybe I'll leave it up to others to actually figure out what HCI actually is. But what I want to be very clear about is that it is not a medical field, for example. It is not clinical psychology, right? So there is much more interest in the technical artifact, But what you can then see in that field is also that people design technical artifacts, either in interdisciplinary collaboration or with a purpose in and of itself without actually involving people from these disciplines. But so basically, in the widest sense, we're looking at work that concerns itself with how humans interact with technology. And so what we've done in that paper, which you can also look up and read for findings in much more detail than what we'll be able to present today, is a critical review of 66 publications in which we analyze which populations, which research methods, which perspectives on play, and which overall purpose and goals existing games for neurodivergent players address. So this is not about commercially available games. This is really about games that have been designed within research teams for what purpose ever it's going to be. And we'll kind of unpack that in the talk as well. And so what we simply want to do today is pick through the most interesting findings with you, see how you think about it, how it relates to the work that you do. Perhaps you'll also bring new perspectives on what we've been thinking about. So we basically just invite you to join us on that journey. In the paper, we adopt different theoretical lenses and views to examine the publications that we came across. So one thing that is good to know about before the start, and many of you are probably already familiar with that, are the different models of disability that exist. So there are medical models, psychological, but also social models of disability, and they all have different implications for how disability is understood, and then in consequence also dealt with. And Marx, for example, has done some good summative work on what the different models of disability provide and don't provide. What is most relevant in the context of our talk is basically the medical model of disability. So if we look at disability, which can also include neurodivergence, depending on how an individual identifies, it really is an individual perspective. So you look at the person and you basically look through a medical lens, you try to find difference, you understand difference as a deficit predominantly. And so in consequence, disability is then seen as something that is in need of being fixed, right? So it's a very intervention-focused model. And in a couple of minutes, we can also talk about how that then translates into technology design. But what's important to remember here is medical models mostly look at one individual, and they also try to figure out what is different about the individual and what needs to be changed through treatment very often. And then we have the social model of disability, which is basically a change of perspective away from understanding disability as a deficit within the individual to looking at the environment and the society, the social context that the person operates within, and really looking at what barriers does the person experience that then in turn cause disability. So it's not so much that question of what's our view on the individual person, but it then lets us ask questions around how can we change the environment that it's actually appropriate for all the humans that operate within it. And so in our work, we've basically leveraged the different models of disability to understand the perspectives that are taken within the different research artifacts, the different games that we've looked at. So to us, it's basically a tool for analysis, because then in the end, it also lets us understand, are we dealing with a deficit-focused perspective on the neurodivergent player, or is there something else going on? Right. When we look at the different models of disabilities, what's also important to understand in that context is that disability can, in turn, actually become part of one's identity. And so that identity-focused perspective is actually really important when we try to understand how people see themselves, how the self changes over time, and also how you can reflect and grow in who you are, basically also, for example, through the consumption of games and other media. And that's where our work links into self-determination theory, which is a psychological theory that is concerned with human motivation. And basically, one of the underlying assumptions is that, everybody has that natural need to basically construct oneself and to try to develop and refine oneself over time, right? And so that's actually quite interesting if we're trying to understand why do people choose to engage with their environment in specific ways, and what are humans inherently trying to achieve in their actions and their thoughts. What self-determination theory looks at in more detail is it's actually basically a macro theory that consists of 6 different mini theories. And in the mini theories, there are then thoughts around the basic needs that humans have. There are also more thoughts about motivation, and also the self-regulatory processes that underpin how humans are intrinsically motivated and how amotivation happens. What's of interest for our work here is that these different types of motivation actually have to do with the fulfillment of the basic psychological needs that humans have. And what self-determination identifies there are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So basically, all humans have this inherent desire to experience autonomy, being able to make our own choices, for example. We want to feel competent. We want to know that we're good at things, basically, get satisfaction out of interacting with our environment, completing tasks. And we also want to feel related. That can be feeling related to others. In the context of games, is also sometimes understood as being able to form a relationship with the game, basically, and then getting some sort of need satisfaction out of that. And the reason why we look at these things is because self-determination theory has actually very frequently been used in the context of games research, and is one of the core theories that is used to explain why humans like to engage with digital games, why people are motivated to engage with games. And so we were interested in how self-determination is or is not supported by games that are developed for neurodivergent players. And so through these lenses, we're then looking at HCI games research in the context of neurodivergence. And what we'd like to do now is actually share with you what we found in those 66 papers that we included in our review.
All right, this is where I take over. I just wanted to acknowledge that there are questions in the chat, and I'm going to briefly address them before I continue, just because as they might be relevant for understanding what we say about going further. So the first question is neurodivergence the same as cognitive disability? If not, what would you say the difference is? So ultimately, the difference is where you come from. Neurodivergence is a term that we use to describe a difference from what is the majority neurotype. So what that means is there are a bunch of neurotypical people, and that is the majority of people, how their brain works, how they perceive their environment, which kind of connections they draw, and all of that. And we understand that as a difference then. If we talk about cognitive disability, and I'm going to go as far as to say I have been diagnosed with a cognitive disability, which is also a learning disability, which is very interesting given that I have a PhD. I was so lucky to only get diagnosed when I was already in the process of receiving one. So do with this as you may, but I would say, yes, I do have a cognitive disability. I'm also fine with experiencing it like that. But the thing is, it's coming more from that deficit-oriented medical kind of like approach to how we define a difference. And that's kind of like where I would say the difference is. It's kind of like the underlying conceptualization of how we deal with the difference. That is between the majority neurotype and other neurotypes. And the second question is there a specific classification in a book or in any other resource of what can be considered neurodivergence? I think other than it's different than what the majority experiences, there is no specific classification. It is inherently meant to encompass a lot of what is traditionally called like different kind of like diagnoses. We have tried in the paper on page 5 to list a bunch of example conditions. Essentially, it can be an acquired or congenital kind of like way of experiencing the world differently from the predominant neurotype. I hope that is useful. So, because those are the lenses through which we examine those games. All right. Next. You're welcome. So our results show basically that existing projects predominantly adopt a serious gaming perspective and relegate play almost exclusively to externally driven purposes. And that means that games are developed to either address specific characteristics or attempt to cure individuals from neurodivergent traits that are perceived and identified as undesirable. And there, the majority of the systems is designed to be played in educational or medical settings. That per se is not an issue, but just a dominance. To take that with, like, we're not trying to critique necessarily all the games that are in this space. We're trying to say it's a bit one-sided to only have these kinds of games. And generally, there is kind of like a strong emphasis on younger players, often children, which makes sense because children always develop, and then you have like this satisfying research experience of actually affecting something. I say that having worked with children and having created play things with children myself, like this is not a dig. But only few projects focus on the needs of neurodivergent adults. And likewise, while most projects included neurodivergent people in system evaluation, involvement of the target audience at the design stage remained then less common. So that means neurodivergent people get like asked whether something is good that has been already developed, but not asked what should be developed. And generally, there were only a few examples of projects that even seek to facilitate this kind of like free, which means like leisurely play for general audiences. And that is the form of play that most frequently is enjoyed by neurotypical people. That's why we play. We get to do it. We don't have to do it, usually. Next. And so oh, sorry. Just do the next one.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. It happens. So here are two examples of like, and this is not really meant as a call out. We appreciate that that this research exists and that these games exist, but we want to point out a few issues of like what happens when you come from a largely medical model in terms of like what that means for neurodivergent players. Just like these are instances of systemic issues, not instances of like, you know, this is bad research. It's more like since most research looks like this, it's a problem that most research looks like this and not that the individual research does this. And one example is the MEDIUS game suite, which is actually not just one serious game, but like similar, like a few kind of like ways of facilitating playful interactions for autistic children, as they say. In fact, it's not really necessarily for children as such or for the players. It is more for therapists to kind of like understand where players are with their therapy success. And the therapy, I do have to mention the therapy that they base this on is applied behavioral analysis, which has been shown to have fundamental traumatic consequences to the form of complex PTSD later in life for autistic people. So if there is anything where I would say don't do that, don't do ABA. We know better now. The paper is older than that, so, but we know better now, at least, like also beyond just the subcommunity. Anyway, this is a quote from the paper. Whoops. MEDIUS is equipped with a facial recognition part added in order to calculate a degree of concentration to know if the autistic child is interested or not in this game. And so the medical purposes, apart from the setting, not even made entirely transparent to the child, which, you know, we see in a lot of technologies for autistic children. That is some work that I did prior to that. And in that regard, player enjoyment plays a role predominantly in how it might facilitate compliance, which is why that has to be monitored. It's not that there should be engagement because people should have fun with the game. There should be engagement because people should be compliant with what the game asks of them to do. It's not play for play's sake, it's play for the sake of monitoring. Now ask yourself how much you would like that. And now we come to this other example, which is also in the context of autism. There's just a lot about autism in there, in that space. Social influences on executive functioning in autism, design of a mobile gaming platform. And I think they really tried, but again, the interest in players' engagement is not a self-sufficient question of enjoyment here, but rather an indicator on compliance, again, in not playing, but rather finishing all elements of the games. Because what do they want to do? They implemented feedback loop to assess executive functioning and be a tool for diagnosis. Now, making diagnosis more fun, you know, like I remember my own process, it was cumbersome, it was way too long, and it was boring, which, you know, is not great for someone with ADHD, but like, I guess that's part of why you do it that way. So I'm all for making that process more fun, but we should also consider that this means that the goal of playing is not play itself, that the goal of playing is really making sure that other goals are met that are extrinsic to the game itself. Yeah, and it's not that you can, like, you know, make the game your own. You basically have to play it in ways that are intended for you to play. You cannot figure out and experiment with like other modes of doing it, or figuring out what you would like to do within the game, or explore what would be good and what would not be. It's really more like you have to be a player that specifically plays in a specific way. Otherwise, this wouldn't work. Remember, play usually is something that we get to do and not something that we have to do. But Kathrin shows now some examples of what happens when there is more of a self-determined perspective.
Yeah, so there actually are also a couple of examples where the authors and the research teams have taken a much more open-ended perspective on what people might want to do with the games that they created. One of them is Stomp, which is basically a tangible computing environment for people with learning disabilities. And I will show you some of the authors' pictures of the platform here. And so basically what the authors themselves say about their system is that they just wanted to design something that creates the opportunity for players to experience the fun of playing computer games. And this is something that is quite interesting, right? Because in a lot of serious gaming contexts, it's always about what can we achieve that has more value than just play, right? How can we get something else into the game that makes it valuable? But here, from the start of the project, it was actually just creating opportunity for social exchange and allowing people to be able to participate in physically engaging experiences. And also leaving some leeway in how the games could be played. And so if you relate that back to self-determination theory, you can actually see that there's more emphasis on autonomy, which is actually dearly needed. And I also just want to highlight here, there are a lot of serious games for disabled players seeking to teach how to engage in social interaction, which often means complying with neurotypical forms of interaction. And here that was a different perspective, because it was really just giving the space where players can then make it their own. And if we actually want to talk about long-term player engagement, giving people the opportunity to make a game their own is also something that is really relevant for allowing people to enjoy games over a longer period of time. And with that, we just want to give you a second example of a completely different project and research approach. And that is Kathrin Gerling's work that has extensively looked at how Minecraft is used within autistic communities. And what they found there is again very similar, something where play and ideas for play came from the players. And again, it's a lot about supporting how players want to be, how they want to express themselves. So again, you can see that basically those grassroots initiatives then leave more space for finding yourself, which also goes back to identity construction. So you can see that play is actually a lot more free in these cases. And if you then tie that back to the original definitions of what actually can be considered play or a game, that element of freedom and self-determination is really, really important in that setting. So it's not all, that single focus on just medical intervention, but there are also some different research approaches. It is possible. And we actually felt that there was a lot to be learned from how these projects were designed and the way that they contextualized neurodivergence in their specific research approaches as well.
By now you might have noticed we have kind of like this good cup, bad cup kind of like a thing going on, but like I'm here to tell you that regardless of like the positive examples, which were very few, like less than 10% within our corpus, the medical model of disability is extremely dominant in the papers that we found discussing games for neurodivergent people. And that's for one, like just the language used that is drawing on a notion of neurodivergence as a deficit instead of a difference. And so most research really draws on that medically tinted knowledge to identify opportunities for play that are deemed suitable for diagnosis, therapeutic, or educational useful circumstances. And in that regard, does not even follow the rigorous demands entailed in medical knowledge production in return. Like that's the other thing. There are all these kinds of, there is all this research out there and like they're claiming these kind of benefits for diagnosis and therapy and so on, but they're not actually following the research standards within those communities that they're saying that they're designing for within that context. But on the other hand, it's also not really for play. And so that's kind of like a double issue that we see there. Going further, to come back a bit to the self-determination, this ultimately leads to a lack of support for self-determination on all three factors. I'm quickly going to go through them so we still have time for questions, but it relates to competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And competency, for example, is implicitly not attributed as neurodivergent populations are predominantly left out contributing to the design or meaning making of games for them. And it's actually quite the contrary. Competency is presumed to lie in the neurotypical assessment, evaluation, and judgment, echoing questions from disability research on really who can be an expert on which topics. If we persistently say that people do not know how they experience the world and are just assessing it from an outside perspective, this, by the way, leads also to issues like ADHD being underdiagnosed in specific genders, such as non-binary people and women. So there are issues if we only look at outside perspectives and how we assess that from not having that lived experience. Going further, regarding relatedness, we find that neurodivergent populations are commonly not invited to relate to their environment and create connections on their own terms, but rather are further reminded of how they are different to a dominant norm and also less than, and how their neurotypical environment fails to relate to them or, us as peers. That means like that the expectation is always that there is kind of like that there's adaptation to an environment that is already dominant and already shaping you so much, and there's never is a bit of a strong word, but it somehow appears that there is very little work in trying to understand how an environment could like also adapt to a specific person, or how you could just work together on like island, metaphorical island. going further, I just want to say that the high amount of games with a diagnostic and therapeutic intent oriented towards kind of like correcting a perceived deficit is a bit counterproductive to support autonomy beyond, like, you know, people can refuse to play with the games, but also refusal as a disabled person towards a dominant environment that has power over you often comes with unclear ramifications for your own safety. And is even more compromised. Remember, most games were for children, and it is more compromised refusal as an option for children because there are multiple factors of power if you're a neurotypical adult interacting with a neurodivergent child, but even as a neurodivergent adult interacting with a neurodivergent child. So instead of installing play as something neurodivergent players get to do, it becomes a tool to package what they have to do. And then, you know, in some cases, you also had that kind of like, oh, people were more motivated to play that, but that is largely extrinsic motivation, which we know doesn't hold for as long as intrinsic motivation. And as we just showed, intrinsic motivation is not really supported at large. So what we would say for the future, next, is just, oh, that slipped in there. Next. What we would just say for the future is that in this area, we need to kind of like reflect on the dominant medicalized language used so far, understand also to a degree that people, that neurodivergent people are also your peers. I have noticed that that helps people to understand that they're not just writing for abstract people, but they're also, you know, that's the thing of doing this type of research. Because when I read these things, especially when it comes to ADHD, but also when it comes to other things, I feel like people are also talking about me and my peers, and that just has a different effect of how I'm going to read these works. But if you realize that, you know, neurodivergent people will read your work, and you might not want to be disrespectful to them in how you frame them as people or as problems often in this kind of research, that might help you just like, you know, understand what you're writing sometimes. Like not you, but just a general you. Anyway, and we suggest that we can conduct more research into existing play strategies of neurodivergent people, and that might also allow us to design games that cater to their experiences and make, like, you know, positive experiences with games, getting to play games instead of having to play games, or at least in addition to. So that will be the moment where we say thank you. We do have Twitter and contact modes, and also just so on the last slide, we also have kind of like the title of the whole thing if you kind of tuned out because I was talking too slow or whatever.
Right, thank you.
Let's ask in case you cannot hear that. So thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
So thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So the criticism you present is mostly targeted towards serious games, and I really appreciate that. Could you also say something about how this applies to the commercial game industry? So you would expect that in that industry there's already more play for play's sake, but does that mean that it automatically caters more to neurodivergent play as well, or not?
I think I would like to point you to an excellent, now many years old GDC talk by Cherry Thompson, who at large spoke about how disability is portrayed in commercially available games. And so how disability is most often actually used as a trope of, you know, introducing something negative within the context of play. So on the one hand, there is that perspective on disability as like a part of the story of games, you know, that where I would argue it's not necessarily catering towards disabled people. But maybe Katta, you want to say something about the play experiences that currently available games facilitate.
I mean, in that commercial space, I didn't do we didn't do a systematic look into that. It's just my experience just in casually looking into that is often it's not really designed with that in mind. I also have seen a lot of advocacy that's basically this is how you design for neurodivergence, even though I would even say within that, you got to understand that this is a very diverse set of people with like different needs. So what you really would have to start doing to make these experiences amenable to other groups of people is making them flexible and like changeable and adaptable. Just that as an aside. The other thing that I see is there's a huge space of particularly mobile games that do target, I would say, vulnerable parents. Parents who are left alone by a system that basically doesn't account for the needs of neurodivergent people in schooling or just society. And then they are being promised like, you know, some kind of like success in whatever they would like to see. And that is an overly promised success. And that is never, I even dare to say never, it is maybe in very single cases that I haven't seen yet, backed by scientific studies that are properly done and like, you know, uphold the standards for some of kind of like, you know, strategies of that. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is also that they're usually meant to help the parents interact with their children and less so, you know, let the children figure out how to live in a world that, I mean, I don't even say that I'm not against all therapy or anything like that. Like I do that myself. I'm very aware that there is a reality that is shaped by neurotypical people and that I have to navigate that, whether that's fair or not. But I just think we can do more as like, you know, society to account for different ways of being. And commercial games really do that even less, which is kind of like why initially my thought was even to go only into that research space, because that might be fairer, because there you're at least have the potential to kind of like have combine these thoughts and be like more progressive about this and also more thorough in what you present as like working or what might define what working even is. So that was actually a try to be fairer to the field and the practical context and industry.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from our audience here? Anything from the chat? I don't think there's popped anything up, but you probably know better than me because I'm not actually seeing chat right now. Okay. Good. I think Katta froze, but Kathrin, you're still here, right? Okay. Well, I guess that concludes our keynote at this point. Thank you very much. Katta is back. Okay, perfect. Hi.
Just in time.
Yeah, just in time for saying goodbye. So thank you so much for taking the time. You're not actually seeing me right now, but I'm looking at you and like I'm waving you.
We can see your arm. Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time for this. Yeah, and have a great rest of the day. I think Katta is gonna tag along for some of the paper sessions at least, and the panel discussion later. So be excited about that, everyone. Yeah, good. Then thanks and bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your conference. Bye.
Bye.